Hello, my name is Aditi Sundan. I am a communications manager at WRI-India, and today I have with me Jaya Dhindaw, Executive Program Director of our Sustainable Cities Program and Director of WRI-India Ross Center, to decode urban adaptation finance. Particularly, what is it, why is it important for India, and the challenges to enabling it. Hi Jaya, thank you for joining us.
Hi Aditi, thank you for having me on this talk.
So, first and foremost, let's address the fundamental question. What is adaptation finance and how is it different from, say, mitigation finance or finance for loss and damage?
Thanks, Aditi. This is a great question to start with. To situate all these three different types of finance, let's say that these are three different forms which are meant to support efforts at various levels, so whether it's local, national, or global. And while adaptation finance and mitigation finance are well established in the climate finance landscape and language, finance for loss and damage is an emerging area that is also highly contested. So let me start by talking about adaptation finance. This is the kind of finance that refers to financial resources provided to help countries, communities, or sectors adjust to the impacts of climate change. So, this includes efforts to reduce vulnerability to climate change by enhancing resilience measures to its adverse effects, such as extreme weather, sea level rise, change in precipitation, and so on. And adaptation finance basically supports projects and initiatives that help communities, particularly vulnerable populations, adapt to the changes brought on by climate change. So it includes actions like strengthening infrastructure, improving water management, and also has broader SDG benefits like safeguarding biodiversity, bolstering food security, improving health outcomes, etc. Mitigation finance, quite simply put, is the financial support that's directed towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global climate change. So, mitigation finance is helping fund initiatives that reduce or prevent carbon emissions, such as transitioning to renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and adopting sustainable practices in sectors like transportation, industries, etc. Electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, solar panels, things that can be productized are what mitigation finance is directed towards. Finally, finance for loss and damage, while there's no official definition of loss and damage under the UN, it broadly refers to the financial resources that support countries and communities in dealing with the losses and damages caused by climate change impacts that cannot be fully mitigated or adapted to. This is also directed towards mostly developing countries, vulnerable countries, etc. And this finance addresses the irreversible or non economic losses, such as loss of life, culture, biodiversity, and the economic costs associated with climate change. So, the goal of this type of finance is usually either compensation for affected population and or financial support for recovery. Now, globally, about 4 to 8% of climate finance is towards adaptation, and the majority is towards mitigation. Adaptation finance, as per estimates, developing countries need about $212 billion per year by 2030 to address their adaptation needs. And in terms of contribution, 98% of adaptation finance is from the public sector, while the private sector's contribution is quite limited and fragmented. For mitigation in 21-22, annual mitigation finance was about 1.2 trillion. And to keep global temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius, sort of current, by the end of the century, annual mitigation finance needs to grow to over 8.4 trillion by 2030 and 10.4 trillion by 2050. So that tells you about the discrepancy in that mitigation finance as well, given that that also has, there's more of that. Loss and damage fund that has been established in 2022 at the COP27 in Egypt. Since then, about 700 million has been pledged to the loss and damage fund, but the estimated need for loss and damage fund by vulnerable nations is anticipated at 580 billion per year till 2030. So all this to say that our climate finance needs are enormous, and we quickly need to secure this for building resilience and for averting further losses to our economy and to our people and our systems.
If we were to now talk about urban climate adaptation finance and climate finance at the subnational level, what kind of climate risks do Indian cities face, and what role can urban adaptation finance play in light of these risks? Why do we need it?
Yes, so India is the seventh most vulnerable country to climate risks in the world. So that tells you about the magnitude of the problem that we face. And in India, just going by some statistics, 17 out of 20 people are highly vulnerable to climate change and its compounding impacts. And 80% of the population, in India suffered heat stress in just the first 15 days of April, which is sort of prime spring season in India, to kind of illustrate how bad this is. And this is some of the analysis that WRI-India has carried out. We also know that about 50% of people in urban areas live in informal settlements. And during periods of heat, these settlements are up to 6 to 8 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding formal settlements. In terms of just displacement, millions of people, about 1.5 in just the last couple of years, have been displaced due to climate change in the country. And it's not just climate change, it is also compounded by the poor state of urban planning and urban management that currently exists in Indian cities. So, in terms of urbanization, I'll give you some statistics for Bangalore. The city has grown by about 170% in the last 3 decades. Most of this growth has occurred in the peripheries, where a lot of the city's natural infrastructure exists. And so, what that has done is the grey infrastructure growing over there has reduced the natural infrastructure in the outside peripheral areas by 50%, reducing the groundwater recharge potential by 50 to 60%. So what this means is you have 10 millimeters of rain within a couple of periods of hours, and you see pictures of, a flooded city. Also, a quarter of the city's population lives in these kind of flood-prone areas. And this is a pattern we see recurring in every Indian city, and this is not just in the bigger ones. The smaller cities and towns, in fact, what we refer to as tier 2 and 3, are more vulnerable because they do not have adequate resources, influence, and capacity to overcome these challenges that they're facing or will face, and in the brunt of the compounding stressors that are there. Now, despite the urgency of the situation, Indian cities also face significant barriers, and there's clearly a lot of inadequate, unsustainable climate finance, which is currently the state in most Indian cities. Heat waves, for instance, which is one of the most pressing climate risks of our time, and in our country has not been notified as a disaster. So what that means is it's making it ineligible for any kind of disaster relief programs and funds. And this is something that impacts the informal sector the most. So adaptation finance is critical because it can help move us from disaster response post facto, which is focused on rescue and recovery, to resilience and preparedness, which is really the need of the hour.
Another aspect is even as public and private investment in climate finance have increased, as you mentioned, majority of it has gone towards mitigation and very little of it has gone towards adaptation. So what are some of the challenges to financing adaptation? Who is most at risk at the absence of it?
So, the easiest thing in my mind, the way I have kind of made sense of this is that mitigation is productizable. You can create tangible products, whether it's, solar rooftops or electric vehicles, which have a very clear ROI, investment profile and everything. And so therefore it is more easily financed. That's part of the reason. Adaptation, on the other hand, very community centric, very localized, mangrove restoration, wetlands protection is not. It's not easily productizable. It actually really varies from sort of context to context. Now, adaptation projects and measures, which for all the right reasons are highly localized, don't find funding due to the limitations of project readiness towards implementation, among many other factors. Typically, when we look at adaptation and resilience projects, they have 3 stages: project preparation, implementation, and operations and maintenance. While whatever finance exists and whatever funders are focused on is the implementation part, the middle part, nobody is looking at the entirety of the whole value chain of adaptation and resilience, which includes the project preparation upfront, which needs to be really sound and robust, and the operation and maintenance models, which also need to be very well thought out and have sort of very good sort of business underpinnings to it. And when I think about barriers, there are several, but I'll illustrate a few. So one is that, many solutions for local and urban adaptation and resilience are blue-green based. So they'll be nature-based. And they have long time horizons to implement and mature. There's difficulties in monitoring and measuring effectiveness, gray infrastructure. You can talk about how much water this will manage in terms of volumes, etc. blue-green infrastructure, not so much also because there'll be variances depending on the context you're placing them in. Also, there are public good characteristics of these kind of projects, and it's difficult to build an economic case because some of these become ethical issues of should such infrastructure be actually charged and should we be monetizing it, and so there's a lack of monetizing frameworks. There's also the issue of small scale, so the large scale opportunities are missing, they're limited. So unless you combine, unless you aggregate, you don't have the kind of opportunities which will be attractive for investors. The next issue is sort of the risks, and the risks are oftentimes non-transparent. One is because there are information and data gaps. The risks are not fully known, and the risk return profile of most projects don't meet investors' criteria, and that becomes a huge hurdle. Another thing is that, these projects often, most of these projects require this multi-sectoral approach. They can also be cross-boundary or cross-administrative boundary. Those are the kind of solutions that are needed at the watershed level, etc. But the ways in which our cities function is very siloed. And so these kind of coordination, cooperation mechanisms, incentives don't exist to make these kind of projects happen. And moreover, when we look at cities and their capacities, they lack the local capacities and sometimes the cohesive policies needed to integrate climate resilience into their broader development plans and agenda. So because of all this, there is a lack of bankable projects and a pipeline of such projects which are investor ready. And that's what makes it so difficult. Who is impacted the most? Clearly, vulnerable communities and the informal sector. 80% of our economic base is informal sector workers. So we are talking about people who are out and about, gig economy workers, construction workers. And if we look at a typical city vulnerability profile, we'll see that about a quarter to half of the population or more live in places with higher climate risk exposure in cities. So it's no surprise that there's such a high level of population in India which is exposed to climate risks.
Thank you for bringing in the equity angle into the conversation as well. As you said that adaptation has to be highly localized and is many of these measures are community centric. Since socioeconomic vulnerabilities are also expected to further intensify as global temperatures rise, you mentioned nature-based solutions as an alternative. So what role can nature-based solutions play in building the resilience of vulnerable groups, considering this existing challenge to financing these measures exists and that these are often considered as public good and the ethicality angle of it?
Yes, so it's very important. And, nature-based solutions, we've been doing this for the longest time, but it's now come into the consciousness of people. And, we've created a certain framing and a name for it. But basically, it refers to sort of sustainable management and use of nature to address societal challenges. The way I like to think of it is that these are solutions by the nature, of the nature, and for the nature. And they can be used to perform a variety of functions. So they can be standalone sort of solutions like wetlands and improving wetlands. They can be in combination with grey infrastructure solutions for things like wastewater management. And they can be used to protect grey infrastructure solutions. So, for example, planting on the slopes of hills to protect the roads that are on those hills. So the good thing about nature-based solutions is that when you consider life cycles, they offer a low-cost, scalable, and resilient way to adapt to climate change, which is especially valuable for vulnerable groups. And while grey infrastructure solutions only solve one problem, it's the problem that they are designed for, whether it's moving water or blocking floods using retaining walls. Nature-based solutions can provide, multiple co-benefits. So you can talk about biodiversity protection, job and livelihood creation, improved ecosystem services. So that's why they're very appealing for communities, and slowly they're becoming more and more appealing for a wider spectrum of stakeholders. Also, the fact that when we talk about nature-based solutions, we are also now talking about them as more being more hybrid in nature, and that these can be leveraged for micro level management of climate risks. So, for example, planting, at a localized level, or digging recharge pits, to meso level sort of solutioning city resilience and creating city resilience. For example, creating these blue-green infrastructure networks across an entire city, to macro level infrastructure inputs. Like saying that there's grey infrastructure, but then how can nature-based solutions supplement that to make it more effective, both in terms of costs and impacts. So yes, nature-based solutions are a set of solutions which are very promising. There are no silver bullet solutions at all in general. But I think everything has pros and cons. You have to watch out for maladaptation, but these set of solutions are proving to be more and more effective and promising in sort of local and urban contexts.
While nature-based solutions contributes, as you mentioned, to addressing the direct risks faced by vulnerable communities and socioeconomic vulnerable communities, there are also indirect risks that they face, right? Because they're engaged in economic activity that often either takes place as in the informal economy or takes place in MSMEs and smaller enterprises. So also there is a clear gap in financing that needs to be bridged, as you mentioned. Particularly for MSMEs and smaller businesses, this must be a challenge. So, how can we make finance accessible to help these enterprises adapt to the increasing impacts of climate change?
And MSMEs is especially an important sector to consider, given that is a big part of our economic system. And also the fact that a lot of these MSMEs are located in tier 2, tier 3 cities. About 60% of India's MSMEs are in these places, which are highly vulnerable to climate risks. One is, creating tailored financial products. So whether we are talking micro loans, blended finance, green bonds, how do you provide smaller businesses with the capital they need for climate adaptation? So, for example, if you're talking about loans, we want to talk about loans which have low interest rates, longer repayment period, climate-specific terms which can be helpful for MSMEs. And there are examples of, microfinance institutions in countries like Bangladesh and Kenya, which have been instrumental in providing small loans for sustainable energy solutions for small businesses or creating flood resilience. Second, of course, is nature-based solutions, things like rainwater harvesting, green roofs, offer cost-effective, scalable ways for these small businesses to build climate resilience. And also to offset some of the operational costs, which can become really huge if they are impacted by these climate risks. So blended finance mechanisms to enable nature-based solutions is an area where we are experimenting. There are some of these experiments are happening even in India and Mumbai, which BMC is leading. So there's evidence of that. Innovation and technology that can democratize access to finance and innovation is going to be hugely helpful for businesses. One, to undertake climate risk assessments, using the kinds that WRI India has developed, like the climate hazard vulnerability assessment tool, to help them understand the climate impacts they face and identify appropriate sort of adaptation measures well in advance. And then secondly, to connect with funding opportunities through digital platforms or crowdfunding, etc. There's also policy support, which is critical for creating an enabling environment for adaptation finance, especially incentives, tax breaks, training, capacity, skill building efforts are very important for these MSMEs. And finally, partnerships. At the end of the day, a large number of MSMEs are dependent on large businesses. That's where they're getting their revenue sources from. And so partnerships between public and private sector can facilitate the flow of finance to where it's needed most and empower these smaller industries. So basically, by combining, a set of these approaches, climate finance can become more accessible, inclusive, and impactful for smaller businesses and MSMEs.
You mentioned microfinance institutions in the developing world as well and the role of partnerships. So, this allows me to take the conversation a little towards the global context. The US elections this year saw Donald Trump win the presidential race, ringing alarm bells in the climate world, as we know. Considering the role that transnational finance or private finance and funding from multilateral organizations plays in enabling climate adaptation in the developing world, how is India expected to be impacted by these recent shifts in the global political landscape?
Yes, so definitely. I mean, we can talk about this in terms of what's the impact, potential impact, what remains and what needs to be done. So when we look at the impact, it's basically twofold, right? The impact on multilateral funds because the US administration's decision to scale back contributions to climate finance has sort of created uncertainty for developing nations, including India, since a lot of the critical resources and sources of funding for climate action, emanates from the US. So that's one impact. The second is that now, because of this, there is a signaling which has happened to the private sector inadvertently, which is going to create, private finance hesitation. So the diminished US leadership in climate initiatives has sent, mixed signals to private financiers globally, potentially reducing their already small contribution in this space and, ability to disburse funds, therefore slowing the momentum of investments towards things like green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, etc. This is, however, an opportunity to turn adversity into strength and innovate. So, if we examine what's left and what's good, one is that there's a shift towards other partners. In India, for example, is increasingly turning to EU nations, China and Japan, which have reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Agreement. Second is, the role of multilateral development banks, organizations like World Bank, ADB, etc., and their continued support on India's climate adaptation work, for example, is going to remain very important and is going to sort of partly offset sort of this US disengagement. What needs to be done and where is the opportunity? One is that, domestic policy and opportunity, there's going to be a whole dependence on domestic efforts now. So with reduced transnational support, India has to emphasize on domestic climate policies, urban resilience programs, and things of that nature. There's also the opportunity for private sector leadership. So Indian corporations, private investors, will need to play a larger sort of role in climate adaptation projects driven by government incentives and market opportunities. This is also an opportunity for MSMEs and startups to sort of innovate on the solutioning side for cost effective solutions to address adaptation and mitigation efforts, connecting back to your earlier question about MSMEs. And finally, I think the big opportunity is that this is an opportunity for India to play a leadership role in the global south and create this whole south-south cooperation on climate action and improve climate finance in this context, especially to fill the gaps which are going to be left by US disengagement. So International Solar Alliance is an example of how this was done previously, where India took a leadership role along with France to promote solar energy deployment in developing nations. And this is a great example of how this is possible and how this can be scaled and how we can achieve impact.
Absolutely. Here is hoping that this silver lining of opportunity will fight its way through the challenge of climate adaptation, whether it's domestic capacity is rising to the occasion or India taking up the leadership role in the global south.
Yes.
Thank you again for joining us, Jaya, and sharing your insights on urban climate adaptation and addressing the many questions around it for our listeners.